Hi, welcome along to Steve Thrift's True Crime Podcast. And today's guest is Steve Thrift, who is an author. How are you, Steve?
I'm very good, thank you.
Great to have you on. You came to my attention with Britain's next bestseller, The Publisher, based in the Northeast. When he notified me last year, actually, that you were planning on putting a book out called Nothing Like the Truth, which is about the Kray Twins, which, of course, as many of my watchers and viewers will know, is something which, is quite close to my heart and something that I've got a lot of interest and a lot of knowledge in. So we will come to the book, slightly later in the chat and podcast. But tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all, Steve. Where were you brought up, and how have you spent your life before you've gone on the journey of being an author?
Okay, well, the relevant part of my life is that I was a police detective in the Thames Valley, and I spent some time at the Old Bailey giving evidence, not as a defendant, I may say, and that gave me the idea of thinking about the famous people that had been in the courtroom that I had been, including the Krays.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a foreboding place for anyone who has probably been up to no good, the Old Bailey. But it's a fascinating place just if you're on a trip to London to go down there and just walk down the street where so many famous and infamous people have walked with their barristers and lawyers. And, I've been down there myself. I've had a photograph outside the old Central Criminal Court doorways, which, haven't changed much over the years. And, had a look up at the scales of justice. It is quite a fascinating place. I mean, you say you were down there, obviously giving evidence. I mean, was any high-profile cases that you were involved in?
Yes, that was a 10-handed armed robbery case and 10 other armed robberies. It was a very serious case, but it was held in the number 1 courtroom. And I looked around the courtroom and thought of the people that had been there, including Christie, Crippen, Hanratty, and the Krays. And I thought, why hasn't somebody written a story about this, whether fictional or factual? And there's a lot about the Old Bailey that people don't know, because the old part of it leads to Newgate Prison, or what was Newgate Prison, and the hangman's gibbet. And that's what gave me the idea. I thought somebody ought to write it, but that was many years ago. It probably took me 30 years to actually get down to writing it.
Has the interior of the court at the Old Bailey number 1 court, has it changed a lot since those days? Back in the days of 68, 69, when the Krays were arrested and tried and found guilty?
No, that part of the court's not changed at all. Number 1 and number 2 courts are separate from the other parts of the court. And what people don't know is the history of it. There are 200 cells beneath that building. And the way out of the court for a defendant is to where the hangman was in the old days.
Fascinating. Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I've never actually been inside. Obviously seen numerous TV programs which have covered it, and looked into the court, and a lot of infamous faces, as you say, but a lot of infamous stories from there as well, and fascinating piece of history. Is it somewhere where the general public can visit, Steve? Is it something that if you can arrange it, can go in, or you have to be basically in the public gallery and going to watch an active case?
I believe it's the public gallery, and you have to have a ticket to do that. But the public are given tickets to do that. But for a famous or an infamous case, it will be a matter of queuing up the tickets in the morning.
Wow, interesting. So, I mean, from your perspective, you say you're a detective. I mean, how long were you serving in the police force? And did you say which force did you say it was, Steve?
I was in the Thames Valley Police Force, and I was 10 years.
10 years, yeah. What made you want to become a police officer?
It wasn't because I wanted to do everything right. I wasn't a do-gooder, but I fancied the challenge. I watched the programs on the television. I was influenced by those, I think. I wanted to be in the Sweeney initially.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, the sight of those guys in the Sweeney is certainly something which you either wanted to be the cops or the robbers watching those programs. So I can imagine why that would be a motivation for you. Was it everything that you hoped it would be, Steve?
Yes, it was. Actually, it was. I learned a great deal about life and about myself during that time. And as I say, during that time, it gave me the thought about writing this book.
Yeah. Can you remember your first arrest?
I can indeed, yes. It was for an assault, and it was a young man. And I remember saying the words that you're under arrest, and I'll probably never forget that. I can't remember who he assaulted or what happened in court, but I do remember he pleaded not guilty.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, were there any scary moments, or hairy moments? I mean, you said that case that ended up at the Old Bailey was a 10-man, robbery. Well, were there any major scary moments for you?
In my career, there certainly were, yes. And the book that's behind you is part of a trilogy in which the Krays deal with crimes, and I've tried to include crimes that I dealt with and that I was involved in. And one of those involved a very wicked man who killed his wife and cut the head off. Before that, he tried to shoot me. So he obviously is included in the third book, I think.
Okay. So, I mean, obviously, from your perspective, you moved on. You did 10 years in the force. Was there a reason for coming out? Had you felt that you'd achieved everything you wanted to achieve? Did you want a career change? What was the reason for leaving?
It was frustration with the lack of promotion. I didn't join to be a PC or a DC with no disrespect. I joined because I wanted to be a senior officer, and I never got to that point, although I qualified for it. In those days, it was very much, certainly in the Thames Valley, a question of dead men's shoes. If I'd have been in the Met, it would be a different case because promotion was automatic, and I passed every possible course that I could take in the police.
Yeah. Yeah, I can understand that. I think the frustration of it is sometimes, they already know who they want to give those jobs, and there's never an opportunity for people to move up the ladder, which can lead to frustration. So when you left the police force, what did you do?
Well, during my service in the police force, I was close protection for the Foreign Secretary for a time, and I went back to doing that for a while, and that took me to some interesting places around the world. Then I went back to investigation. Again, that took me around the world as well.
There must be a book in that, Steve, to be honest, looking after looking after somebody as important as a foreign secretary.
Yes, but it would be a very short book. It'd be a pamphlet, and it would I think it'd be quite boring, really.
Yeah. You never know. It's those kind of stories some people really enjoy reading about, that kind of stuff. It's interesting. I mean, my background is security as well. I did 18 years. I did some close protection. I also did door work in Newcastle and Ibiza and London. So I also did debt collection work. So it's it's one of those things. You always end up with plenty of stories, and you feel that those stories wouldn't be interesting, but you never know. So what led you to writing then? Obviously, you're standing in the Old Bailey, giving evidence as a serving police officer. You've obviously looked around and thought of the likes, as you said already, of the Krays and Christie and Crippen, etc. And that's given you the idea. Did you always have an interest in writing, or was it something that you discovered once you decided to put pen to paper or drag a typewriter out of the cupboard?
Well, it really was a question that I was ill a few years ago, and I thought of something that I maybe I should do this before anything happened to me, and I wanted to get it out of my system. And having got it out of my system, I became so fascinated with writing that I just carried on, and it's become an obsession more than anything now.
Are you a reader of crime books, or were you? I mean, you've already mentioned that you've used some of your own experiences from working in the police force in some of the stories in these books. Was it always the idea to pull on personal experiences, or are you coming up with new ideas?
It never was, but having started the genre, I thought, well, maybe it's more interesting if I can write it from a policeman's point of view. Yeah,
that makes sense. So, have you found it difficult to write, or I mean, I know when I'm writing, I mean, I've written many books now over the years. Have you found there's a good time for you to write? Do you like to get up in the morning and stuff, or are you somebody who likes to get up, go through your routine, and then maybe do a little bit in the morning, a little bit in the afternoon? What's your approach to writing?
I think it's a question of being disciplined to write, and I have disciplined myself to do that. And I have a word count that I have to achieve every day, and I'm dissatisfied if I don't do that. I often beat that word count, but I think it's a question of discipline, and it's something that I very much enjoy, and I feel that once I get behind the keyboard, it flows.
Yeah. Do you ever suffer writer's block?
I haven't yet, but then again, I've only written 6 books.
Still 6 is a hell of an achievement. Writing 1 is an achievement, but writing 6 is a hell of an achievement. Writer's block is one of those things which I've suffered on, numerous occasions. But I find that if I do end up in that situation, I think it's best just to walk away from the keypad and go and do something else, and you'll come back to it refreshed, or you'll find you can achieve what you want to achieve just by taking that little bit of time out. Sometimes you're looking at something too heavily or thinking about it too heavily, and go back to it. It all makes sense when you go back, refreshed with a more relaxed pair of eyes, I find.
Yes, indeed.
So give us an indication of the idea for this first book, and obviously we've got the cover there. As I say, Britain's next bestseller. Dave McCaffrey has now published this book. It's only recently out, and you can get order copies on there, and I think you can get it on Amazon as well, Steve. Nothing Like the Truth, which is a great title, and obviously it's about the notorious Kray. So, why, out of all the people who you heard about in court number 1, did you choose the Krays?
I think because they've always been a fascination with the British public, and I decided that possibly their story wasn't complete, and I wondered what would have happened had they been found not guilty at that court case. And in my book, because of corruption and various other matters, they are found not guilty. And one wonders what would happen if they were found not guilty and they continued with their spree.
Where does the book start, Steve?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Where does the book start off?
It starts off just before the trial. No, it's the trial of the Krays at the Old Bailey.
Okay. And obviously, from my perspective, they get a not guilty. Is the first book concentrating on that, the immediate time after that, or does it go on a few years? What can you give us any indication of what the story is about?
Sure. The first book is entirely about the trial and about other things surrounding the trial. It involves a lot of people, some who are fictional and some who are not. And I've had authority from some of those people to put their names in there. And it purely involves the trial and immediately after the trial. The second and third book go on from that.
Is the is the first book we've mentioned already that some of your previous cases that you worked on, does it include any of those stories? Is there any stories in there from your case work?
Not the first book. That's the second and third book. The first book is purely a fictional account of the Krays trial.
Right. Okay. How much research did you have to do on the Kray story, or was it something that you were fairly up to date with? Had you done much reading about the Krays?
Yes, I've read. In fact, I bought every book there was possible about the Krays that I read before this, and I've talked to people that knew them, and I've done as much research as was possible.
Why do you think that the Krays hold such fascination for the British public?
I think because they were different things to different people. In the East End of London, they were, and they still are to a degree, folk heroes, and to other people that don't really know the story, they were very bad people.
Yeah. Does it surprise you that they were thought of as folk heroes in the East End?
Having spoken to people that knew them, no, not really, not at all. In fact, not at all. They were good to the people that they lived around, and they looked after the old people. But deep down inside, I think they were very evil people.
Do you think the Krays were good criminals?
I don't think they were. No, they had good criminals around them because they liked to get other people to do the dirty work most of the time, apart from obviously the 2 murders.
Yeah, I was going to say that was going to be one of my next questions. Does it surprise you, how the Krays would often use other people to carry out, bad crimes, misdemeanors, etc. Did it surprise you how naive they were to first of all go into the Blind Beggar pub as Ronnie Kray did and shoot George Cornell dead in front of witnesses, and then of course lure one of the firm members, Jack the Hat McVitie, to Everton Road and stab him to death in front of witnesses. Did it surprise you that they were as naive and possibly as arrogant to do those kind of things?
No, I think that it didn't surprise me at all. I think they were extremely arrogant, and I think that was their downfall in the end.
I mean, the firm members who obviously were around them at the time, some of course evidence, others kept their mouth shut and obviously paid heavy prices with the long sentences that they received. The Lambriano brothers spring to mind, Chris and Tony, of course. Freddie Foreman, I think, was probably unfortunate in the circumstance to be, given some time for this, but he, by his own admission, got away with other things which he should have been given time for. Charlie Kray, of course, the elder brother, was given the 10 years as well for his involvement in the Jack the Hat case. Did those people feature? Did the likes of Foreman and Charlie Kray and the Lambriano feature in the book?
In the first book, they feature very heavily because there has to be a lot of jury tampering going on to fix the trial at the Old Bailey, and who better to do it than those creatures? Yeah.
Obviously, you're from a police's perspective. The hero of the day in the Krays case was obviously a guy called Leonard Nipper Reid, who sadly has passed away this year. He was also a fantastic servant to the British Boxing Board of Control. He sadly passed away this year. But yes, with Leonard Nipper Reid, does he feature in the book?
Yes, of course he does. Yes, the people that actually dealt with him feature quite heavily in the book, and Nipper Reid features quite heavily as well. In certainly the first 3 books I've written, he features in them all, and he doesn't feature very well, but it was written out of respect to him anyway, and I think everybody knows that.
You're obviously going on. I mean, you've already mentioned that you've got numerous books on this subject. Are we going to see the Krays moving through generations? Because obviously the book will be starting in the very late 60s, of course, when the Krays went to trial. Of course, arrested in May 68. They went on trial and were convicted in May 69 and given 30-year recommendations. But obviously in your book, they're going to be free men. Are we going to see the Krays progress through different eras? The 70s, are we going to see them walking around longer hair, Farrah flares, and are we going to see them dominating the robbery scene and potentially taking over the drug scene in the 80s and 90s, or are we going to be just sticking to a certain generation, Steve?
Well, I can't give too much away, obviously, but in the current book that I'm writing, it's at the moment it's up to about 1983, and they're still dressed in the same suits, and they don't like to get their hands very dirty. But it's set in 1983, and it'll go forward from there a little bit.
Do you think that's why? I mean, I've already asked you about why the public fascination. I've often said that it was, a lot of it has to do with that it was in the 1960s, and the 60s is this. It's almost in a bubble of its own in terms of generations. But we have a lot of people who are high profile in that particular era, not more so than photographer David Bailey, who obviously took a notorious photograph which adorns your cover.
Yes.
Which was also the photograph that drew me into the Krays story, because originally it was on the front cover of John Pearson's the very first book on the Krays, The Profession of Violence, and that's how I got my interest in the Krays. I saw that at a book sale. I bought the book. My English teacher then allowed me to take Profession of Violence as part of my curriculum, as part of my GCSE exams, and that's how my interest in the Krays grew. I then wrote to the Krays as a 16-year-old and offered them a business proposal to put that image on a T-shirt. But my life changed because of that photograph. And I think, do you think a lot of people were drawn in by Bailey's images because obviously it was part of his picture box, book that came out in the 60s. He included the Rolling Stones in there, the Beatles, obviously, the Krays were in there. It's almost as if David Bailey took those photographs and put them in a time capsule and made them famous.
Yes, I totally agree with you there. I think David Bailey is responsible for a lot of their infamy by putting their picture out there, and that like you say, the picture behind you is one that everybody knows about and can relate to. I think.
I mean, obviously the Krays were, they were only running the East End. I mean, they were in this particular, Mile End Snooker Club, which where they started out. They moved on to take over the various clubs. But when we talk about clubs and spielers nowadays, we think of big, vast venues which have got huge open spaces and dance floors, etc. But in theory, a lot of these places were actually above betting shops or whatever. They were actually in people's front rooms, some of these places which were called clubs. So they were king of all the surveyed to a degree, but it wasn't as we would know nightclubs and bars now as such. But do you think that there's that era is gone? Do you think in the East End of London, I know the demographic has changed down there now, and you walk down Bethnal Green and it's a lot of the signs are in Arabic, and the ethnic minority is probably the majority down there now. But do you ever think that kind of thing could be repeated, where you have two brothers who run a certain section of the East End of London and get away with murder?
The answer is they only get away with it in my books. But in real life, I don't think that's at all possible these days, because I think policing has moved on so much since those days that it would be impossible for two men like that to get away with it now. Yeah.
I mean, your stories, of course, they involve the Krays. Is it a, without giving too much away, is it a good versus evil kind of plot throughout these books? Good versus evil. Is the wind on both sides, Steve?
Well, I think in the later books they try to do good. Their version of doing good isn't everybody else's version of doing good, and they find the police to be slightly wanting in their investigations, and so they decide that they will deal with some of the crimes their way.
Yeah, a lot of people, when they're given such a recommendation in a sentence and they're sent to prison, we never hear from them again. But the Krays, behind bars became more popular, and I know from my own experience, actually made more money. They became more profitable behind bars. Why do you think that was?
I think because, David Bailey, again, I think is responsible for that. And I'm sure that they were great friends of his because of that. And I know you said about the properties that they owned, but they actually owned a huge amount of properties, a vast amount of property in the East End and the West End of London. Not just the little shops, but they did own big clubs. And they used to go into pubs and befriend the owners, and then they would take the gang in there, the firm, and then they would tend to take over the pub completely, and certainly take the profits. That was one of the usual things which people don't know very much about, but that was the way that they acted.
Have you paid particular interest in Ron's mental illness throughout the books? I think it's something which is often forgotten about. That Ron was actually a paranoid schizophrenic, and obviously in those days, the only way that they would, be able to, diagnose that and treat it, was they called you mad and gave you Stematol. And if you take your tablets, then your paranoid schizophrenia could get out of control. You certainly weren't meant to mix your tablets with alcohol, but Ron clearly did on more than one occasion. But yeah, do you look into his mental illness in these books?
Yes, it features quite heavily, and that they were. What people don't know is they were fairly religious as well. That features quite a lot as well.
Fantastic.
But the mental illness certainly features, and that gets worse as time goes on.
And the sexuality, Steve, I've got to ask you about that. I think over recent years, prior to before Reg and Charlie passed away in 2000, I think there was more indication than ever that Ron we all knew was gay, but that Reg potentially was gay. Is there? Do you look into that as well?
Yes, of course I do. Yes, that's the part of that everybody knows, and it features very heavily as well. Not too heavily, but of course it's part of their story. And I think Reg's part of it, I haven't overlooked it, but I think he tried to overlook it by marrying eventually, and that Ronnie didn't like that and did something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was such a tragic story. Francis sadly was such another victim in the Kray story. What's your take on Charlie Kray, Steve? Because Ronnie and Reggie Kray, we know both committed murder. Ronnie, of course, as I've already mentioned, shooting George Cornell in the Blind Beggar pub, and Jack the Hat, becoming victim to Reggie in a knife frenzy in Evering Road. Charlie Kray always seemed to be the unlucky one. He was the older brother. He spent time in the Navy. He had a great boxing record. He seemed to spend his life tidying up after the twins. He sadly got, woken up, by one of the firm members once Jack had been murdered, and essentially told to try and get it cleaned up. And he obviously then involved Freddie Foreman in that, and they both ended up getting 10 years, 10 years for being involved. Neither of them were actually at the murder. But essentially, with Charlie Kray, there's always this impression that he was just the unlucky Kray. Do you paint him as do you paint him as part of the film, or do you paint him as a bit of a bit of a naive extra in the story?
I think you're exactly right. I think he was very naive, and he did the things he did because of his brothers, and he didn't want to be seen as being the weak one. That's my take on him.
Yeah. Obviously, you'll have watched over the years, as the Krays, passed away one by one. Ronnie Kray, of course, died in 1995. Ironically, died on Comic Relief Day. But when he was buried and given his funeral, the turnout in London was akin to the turnout that they had for Winston Churchill's funeral. As a former service police officer, did that surprise you? Did it horrify you? Did you wonder what on earth people were doing? What was your take on the funeral of Ronnie Kray?
I think, yes, it surprised me. I think it surprised a lot of people, actually. But hearing about it afterwards, that the punch-ups that there were at the funeral between the Richardsons and the Krays still carried on, didn't it? And I think that surprised me as much as the turnout.
I mean, I was there. I was actually Charlie Kray's security on the day. I'd been asked to go down and look at Ron's body at the funeral parlour, English funeral parlour, but I couldn't make that. Dave Courtney and some of his security were actually doing that during the week. But on the day, I was obviously asked to be, security for Charlie Kray, and it was a surreal day for me. That was the day that I realised that I had to start making notes about my involvement with the Krays, and I think it was a wake up call for me, being in the cortege in the car as we went over the Bow flyover, and they were doing some work on the Bow flyover at the time, and there was 6 workmen with their yellow hard hats basically off, and at the front with a hard hats bowed as the cortege passed, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I mean, of course, there'd been a lot of rumours and over the years that was where Jack the Hat's body was buried, under the Bow flyover, and it was the irony of seeing Ronnie Kray going over the top of it, these guys paying their respects, normal 9 to 5ers, and the potential of Jack the Hat being underneath us, and it was just a wake up call for me. I think that I was being a little bit young and naive, that I was involved in this inner circle with the Krays, and that maybe I should start writing this down. So that was the beginning of my notes, which eventually led to me publishing the Krays, the Geordie Connect. But yeah, I think it was bizarre, and I think what actually happened with the Krays was they essentially, they realised that the legend or their legend was probably the most important thing to them. I think I ended up becoming a bit of a keeper of the Kray flame, in the sense that you had to keep making them relevant. And on visits that I had with Reg would constantly be bringing out bits of paper. We would always have ideas for different different business enterprises or different books, etc. And yeah, I mean, like I said before, the Krays were constantly making money, behind bars, but the legend became the important thing. And they, once they shuffled off this mortal coil, they'd always be remembered. And I think that became the most important thing too,
Yes, I think yes, I didn't realise that you worked for Charlie Kray. So what was your opinion of Charlie Kray then? Your own opinion?
My opinion, well, I visited Reg in prison for 10 years. I visited Broadmoor for 5 years, and I became friends with Charlie. I felt very sorry for Charlie. Another book which I brought out myself with Britain's next bestseller was a book called Operation Ask, which I believe is still on sale on their website, and that goes into the final case of the Krays, which was Charlie Kray was arrested in 1997 for his involvement in conspiracy to supply £37 million worth of cocaine. The time he was arrested, I think it was with Ronnie Fields and another. But it was police officers from the northeast, undercover police officers from the northeast, who were working on numerous occasions. Charlie was invited up to stay in Linden Hall, just outside Newcastle, near the airport, and he basically promised that he could deliver, he could deliver cocaine. I mean, when you look through the case files, look at the undercover tape, which are cover in that book. Again, I think it just showed a naivety on Charlie's behalf, because Charlie was not a big-time drug dealer. He wasn't a big-time drug trafficker. Charlie didn't have a penny to his name. He was Charlie Kray. He made money out of being the elder brother of the Krays. But unfortunately, because of the change of laws for him, he got entrapped, I believe, by the police, and I believe the paperwork shows that in the book. He basically just got sucked in, and unfortunately, if I have a conversation with you, Steve, and you say to me, "Can you get me something?" and I go, "Well, I'll try." I make a phone call to somebody, and I go, "Oh, I've got my pal Steve. He's after something here. Is any chance of sorting him out?" "Yeah, I can do that." I put you two in touch, and then I go off and live my life. Then, if that something that I've put you in touch about turns out to be drugs, and I'm unbeknown to it, you go off and do a drug deal with this guy and get arrested. The person who gets the biggest jail is me, because I've introduced the pair of you, and it's it's expected that I've had something to do with it. But I genuinely believe that's what happened with Charlie. He was a bit stupid, he was a bit naive, and unfortunately for him, it ended up being a life sentence, because going into prison in his 70s and being given a 12 and 8 currently, that was always going to finish him off. And my last visit with him in Franklin prison before he was moved to the Isle of Wight, which is where he died. And, he was a tragic figure to see. I mean, gone was the tan, gone was the dyed hair. He was sitting in prison civvies. And I always feel, Steve, was a little bit of a, shall we say, a government exercise, because the last thing that the government or any government would have done was either of the Kray twins to be walking free, in England and appearing on chat shows as they probably would have done. And I always feel that Reg's parole was up. He had a really good barrister alongside him by this time, because he'd remarried to another woman called Kray. And I always feel that it was a little bit of a pawn being moved in a game. And the one way to stop Reggie Kray getting out was to make sure that the Kray's name was in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. And that was simply, let's target Charlie Kray. Let's get the Krays on the front pages for the wrong reasons. And then if it ever comes to Reggie Kray having another parole opportunity, we can always point to the fact that if his brother is not going to change, what chance has he got to change? So I always think it was a big pawn in a game. We'll never know, of course, because, soon after Charlie was, given that ultimate life sentence, Reggie Kray was, essentially diagnosed with cancer, something which they could have essentially diagnosed a lot earlier, but they refused him hospital treatment, refused him any examinations until it became, impossible to do so. And then once he was checked out, of course, the cancer had gone too far. He was riddled with cancer, and then he was given a posthumous release, and he died, obviously, in a hotel in Norfolk. So a tragic end to a story. Some may say it's a just end for somebody who took somebody else's life. But I also feel with Reg, moving off Charlie, I also feel with Reggie Kray that because he never showed remorse, Steve, he never apologized for his crimes. He obviously went on to profit from books by talking about murder. That, I always feel that he never had a chance of getting parole anyway, and his behavior in prison was never acceptable, really, as well. He had many warnings for being drunk in jail, whether it was from prison hooch or from alcohol that was sneaked in on visits, or approaching young offenders. He'd been told off on more than one occasion for, spending too much time with young offenders and being a bit of a pest to them. So sad end for Reggie. And as I say, a lot of people say it was just, but I could only speak as I find, and I only met the twins, as two, prisoners who'd been institutionalized for over 20 years. So I can only speak as I find, but I got on quite well with all three of them, but in different ways. I wish I'd met them later in life, though, because I'd love to know the real reason they were coming to Newcastle. And of course, when I was visiting them when I was younger, it was something which it wasn't in my mind. I didn't really know the people in Newcastle then who were in their circle. I've subsequently gone on to make a documentary about it, and we've got all the stories out there, why they were here. We've got photographs of them in Newcastle, etc. But we'll never really know the real reason why they were here,
Yes, of course. And of course, they went to America as well. Did you cover that in your stories?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, with Ron going to America, there'd been books done already. Colin Fry's done a fantastic book about Charlie Kray and the mafia. We've looked into that. I mean, whether you've seen it or not, there's an FBI paper which is readily available. There's copies of that you can buy on the internet. A lot of it's blacked out, but the Krays, had ins with a lot of people, but like we said at the start of the podcast, he wasn't, they weren't the brightest of criminals. But looking for a better expression, they were thieves' ponces. They would allow you or me to go off and do a bit of work on their manor. Then they'd be knocking on your door saying, "Where's our cut?" And if you didn't give them their cut, they'd be beating you up. And that was what they did. They had a profession of violence, So it was interesting. But yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating story, and I think the fact that you've chosen to do a fictional books around them and about a release rather than a conviction, I think is fascinating. I think you'll find a lot of certainly will be interested in it. Have you ever watched any of the films, Steve? You've read all the books. Have you ever watched the films?
Yes, I've watched the films and I've met the actors. And in fact, I asked one of the actors involved if they would be interested in making a film of this trilogy that I've written, and they consider themselves too old at the moment. Right.
What do you make of which was your favourite film?
I have to say I like the first one with the Kemps.
Yeah,
I did enjoy that, but I don't think it was anywhere near accurate. But it was a good story.
It's very difficult in the film to cram, so many years of life into 2 hours. That's the problem.
Yes, of course.
Ray Burgess, of course, was the man behind that film. He got together with Dominic Anciano to get the funding in and bring the film together. And Medak, of course, directed it. We've teamed up, myself and Freddie Foreman's godson. We've teamed up with them to do Freddie's life story. So the script's been written already, and it's now in the financing stage. So that will be another film, which will of course touch on the Krays, but concentrate more on Fred's life. Getting away from the crime side of the Krays, I suppose, has it surprised you how crime's changed, Steve, over the years? And like I mentioned a bit earlier, in the 1960s, it was, you had the Krays running London, demanding money with menaces, protection rackets, etc. There was a little bit of drugs in there with uppers and downers and things like that. But then you moved into the 1970s era, where it was all about the pavement. It was all about robberies and armed robberies. And then the police became armed in the 70s, so that deterred a lot of robbers getting involved. In that kind of game. And then we moved into the 80s with drugs, and drugs became the currency on the street. So has it surprised you how crime's changed, Steve?
It hasn't surprised me, but of course they started really. They started when they were young, but a lot of the gangs became criminals during the war, didn't they? Opportunists, I guess, when they escaped national service or went AWOL from national service, they became opportunists. And I think a lot of the gang started as opportunists. I don't think there is that opportunity anymore for villains to become that way. I think the police have become more sophisticated in their ways. I'm not a great police supporter, I have to say, at the moment, but I think they've become very sophisticated these days, and it's more difficult for people like the Krays or the Kray gang to operate.
It's interesting that you say you're not a big fan. You're not as big a fan of the police these days. Is there a particular reason for that, Steve? Is it the method that they use, or is it, I'm just interested to know.
When I joined the police officer as a police officer, the rules were a lot different. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act made life difficult for serving police officers that had served under the judge's rules. It basically meant that you had to be nice to people all the time, and they had more rights. And I was in the murder squad at that time, and I dealt with some very bad people. In fact, I was dealing with people that you never want to even talk to, and you have to be nice to them. And I found that very difficult. I found it impossible. So that probably was another reason for me leaving, that I couldn't operate under the conditions. The conditions now are even worse for them, better for villains, but worse for the police. And I don't think it's right. I don't think that they should be hampered by all the rules that they are. But in my day, it was really, if you interviewed somebody, if you arrested somebody and you interviewed them, if you were better than them, they were charged. If they're better than you, they walked out of the police station. You always shook hands. That's the way it was, and I believe that's the way it should have stayed. And that's just my take on it. I'm sure there's nobody else who thinks that way.
Back in your day, Steve, you had to be a certain height as well. What always amazes me about the current police force is that we get all different shapes and sizes, and I know that they obviously still have, the strict medical, etc. Before you become a serving police officer. I believe they still do things like the beep test, etc. But it always surprises me that there's a lot of police officers well under 6 foot, sometimes 5'7", 5'8". Physically, they don't look in the best shape. Does that surprise you?
Well, I'm 5'8", and I just squeezed in.
Right.
But in those days, you had to be fit.
Right.
That was very much a part of it. You had to be fit. Now there is no height or weight regulations, because I think that's against your human rights to be biased on those conditions. So I don't agree with that at all. How can you run after a villain if you are overweight and underfit?
Mm. I mean, technology, as you say, has come on leaps and bounds now, and the policing has obviously changed as well. You have a sense now that police would rather allow criminals to get away with crimes because they know that they're always going to be able to catch up with them at a later date. So whether it's a CCTV camera which is in the right place, which can catch an armed robber, or someone who's stealing someone's bag, or whether it's someone carrying a smartphone. Smartphones are essentially tracking devices. They can tell any police officer who can get into those phones can find out where you've been, what time you were there, and sometimes even who you were with because of the connections between phone masts. It's it's almost a case of we can catch you after the crime, we don't have to catch you doing the crime anymore.
Well, I think, like I said before, I think technology has moved on so far that it allows them to do. It's made the job somewhat easier. But I think they still want to catch them before they do anything else. So catching them later, I don't think is an option.
And the laws have changed to the degree now where, even if you are a villain and you've got away with things 10 years previous, and, if you can't prove where your money's come from, when you eventually do get caught, they can obviously confiscate all your ill-gotten gains. So, you might have that nice £150,000 car and £150,000 house, but if you can't prove where you got that from or where the money came from that purchased it, there's confiscation orders now. So, as I've had on my show, on numerous occasions over the last few months, I've had a lot of former criminals who will remain former criminals because they've, not only have they learned their lesson, but they now see that, crime, literally does not pay, which unfortunately back in the day it did.
Yes, the Proceeds of Crime Act has changed all that, hasn't it? Completely. Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah. Obviously, off our turf and in another country, a lot of publicity, surrounding the, the death of George Floyd. I mean, I would presume that just horrifies, somebody like yourself who served the force in England for 10 years, but to see an acting police officer in America, actually kill somebody it just wonders what kind of world we're living in.
Yes, I agree. Of course, I think it horrified the whole world. But what wasn't publicised was the amount of white people that have been killed in the same manner by American police. There are very many of them, and that's never been publicised really.
it's something that's going to go on and on, Steve. I think certainly. So getting back to your book, your books. You know, this one that's out now is just being released. Obviously, there's been a slight delay with Britain's next bestseller because of the horrendous pandemic that we've all been going through. What's the release schedule for books, and you know, do those other books have names yet?
Yeah, they all have names. The second one is called. The second one is just following from this, and as is the third one. But I've also written a book about Jack the Ripper in 1988 with modern police techniques, and Britain's next bestseller wants to release that after this one. So I'm very happy for them to do as they wish, because I'm very proud of that one. I'd like to say that with this one, I've had a huge amount of support from people, including Fred Dinenage, who wrote their official story, obviously, and two members of the gang have been incredibly helpful as well. Others, like Freddie Foreman, for instance, completely blanked me because I felt it was important that I should tell them that I was a policeman. And I think for that reason, I've been blanked by everybody else that I've approached about this that was involved in the game.
I mean, if you get me a copy of the book through David, I will certainly, A, I'll give it a review, but B, I will be able to get it into the hands of Fred. I've known Fred for 25 years. So, you know, if you want us to get a copy of the book to Fred, then might be able to give you some endorsement for your other ones. But yeah, if you don't mind doing that, Fred sits at home a lot these days and likes to read books. So
sure, yeah,
I'm sure he'd be interested in reading it and having a look at it anyway.
Yeah, if nothing else, you might find it amusing.
Yeah, I think he would do. Yeah, he'll want to know what he gets up to if he gets off. That's for certain.
Yeah, if I remember rightly, he is involved in the first book. He's certainly mentioned the first book.
The one thing about Fred was, you know, he didn't get the title managing director of British Crime for nothing. So, you know, you've always got to remember that. I think if you include
get that.
Yeah, if you include them in other books, that is. Well, that's great. Listen, been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. And as I say, nothing like the truth, which is about, of course, the Kray Twins walking free, is by Steve Thrift. You can buy it on Britain's Next Bestsellers website. We'll post the details for that in the biog, so you can go straight to the website. Failing that, if you want to go to Amazon and just search out Steve Thrift books, you will find that on there. And keep an eye out, of course, if you set yourself to following Steve on Amazon, you'll probably get notifications of when these other books come out. Anything else you want to say, Steve, about the books, etc., or the Krays in particular?
No, they will continue to fascinate me, and I believe what I am writing would have been the way that they would have acted had they been released. So it's something that I feel very passionately about. And like I say, I've had a lot of support. Bernie Feynman, who was their young mechanic at the time, has been my biggest supporter. And I can't thank him enough, and the people that have supported me.
Well, Steve, good luck with it, and best of luck. Hopefully it will get dramatised at some point. It's certainly something I would watch. But for now, Steve Thrift, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.